are. We're on the air. Okay. Sorry. It's the very last night. It's week 14, and we're about to finish everything up as much as we can. We hope we'll get everything finished tonight. In the first hour, we're going to do the Christianization of Scandinavia, and as I wrote these lectures, it seemed to me more logical to talk about the Christianization and conversion before we talk about the formation of Scandinavian kingdoms, even though they happen pretty much simultaneously, but the movement toward conversion seems to start a lot earlier, but we're tracing different things to look at the movement toward Christianization. They're actually simultaneous. They're movements that take place, and really they both start from the moment the Vikings make contact with Christendom, with continental Europe. There is a trend toward forming those kingdoms because the chief leaders want the power of a king. And there's a trend toward Christianization because missionaries are being sent, and the Vikings are being pressured to convert to Christianity. Christianity is a missionary religion, and the first thing they want to do is convert the pagans that they come up against. So these movements are happening simultaneously, and it kind of makes sense to put them at the end, because at the moment when the Vikings are Christianized and the kingdoms are formed, when the Christian kingdoms are formed, they're not Vikings anymore. And so that's why I put this at the very end. Then they're Europeans, they're Scandinavians, but they're not Vikings anymore. So I put that at the very end. If we get through the formation of Scandinavians in the first Scandinavian kingdoms in the first hour, that will be good. If we don't get through, we'll do it in the second hour, because that's kind of a short one. And then at the very end, I'll do a very quick overview of the course, and then some review questions that are going to be on the final exam, some issues to discuss that will be final exam questions. And I'm hoping you all will think about them and maybe come up with some ideas to help you get started in your studying. So that's the plan for tonight. So let's look at the conversion to Christianity. Here are some missionaries, and the missionary movement in the Christian church dates all the way back to the first apostles that followed Christ, because what he told them was go out and preach the gospel to all the world. And so a missionary movement is built into Christianity. And the 12 apostles and then St. Paul came along, and they were all missionaries. And then we had a prime missionary movement coming from St. Gregory the Great, Gregory the First, around 600, when he sent missionaries to convert the English. And so then the English became a primary fount of missionaries, because they are in the direct line of that missionary tradition, and so it was very natural for them to send missionaries into the Scandinavian world. So the Christianization begins with a missionary movement everywhere the Vikings went. Christianity, however, came late to Scandinavia. The Anglo-Saxon church was really the mother church of Norway, but the conversion took about 300 years. It took repeated efforts and wave after wave of missionaries to convert Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. The Germans got to Sweden first. It was the Scandinavians who went to Norway. The Germans got to Sweden first, and there was a Christian community there for 150 years in Sweden before the Anglo-Saxon missionaries arrived. So they're coming from a number of different sources. Denmark drew from everywhere. Denmark was closer to the continent, and so Denmark was Christianized first. The Scandinavians heard of Christianity from three sources. The first was slaves taken on expeditions, so that, especially in Ireland, they took a lot of Irish slaves, and so slaves brought Christianity. Frisian merchants visited and settled among the Scandinavians, and so the Frisian merchants were largely Christian, and they would have been another influence. And finally, Scandinavians who had visited foreign lands came back with news about Christianity and information about it. Some of them even converted. And a lot of them, and those are people bringing it home to Scandinavia, but we've already seen that the Vikings went everywhere into Christian countries, and we've talked about some of them being converted in England, in Scotland, as they interacted with Christians on every level. In 829, there was a Swedish or Rus embassy to the court of King Louis the Pious of France. And when they got there, they were coming through there, brought by Byzantine emissaries who were going to the court of Louis the Pious. And according to the French chronicles, they asked that missionaries be sent to Sweden. And so in 822, earlier, Louis had already sent Ebo, Archbishop of Reims, to Pope Paschal I to inquire about the Scandinavian countries. Now, do you all remember who Louis the Pious was? Who was Louis the Pious? He was the son of Charlemagne. Okay, he was the son of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne, he was real lucky that all his brothers died, and he was the only son who survived. So he inherited Charlemagne's realm. He was a very strong king, and he ruled for quite a while. And he was a very large supporter of the church, so it made a lot of sense for Louis to support the conversion of these Vikings. And the Vikings were already attacking the mainland of the continent, and so Louis was interested in these pagans. So he had sent Ebo of Reims to Pope Paschal I to inquire about these. And these are Carolingians. We can see the Carolingian soldiers who look very, very Roman, actually, in their tradition. And here are the first Christians who went to Denmark, and who were the first Christians of Denmark? What have we got here? The tomb of Gorm the Old, who's the first real king of Denmark, built by his son Harald Bluetooth. And this is the Jelling Mound in Jelling and the Jelling Church. And it was built. Here is the Jelling Church. This is this is a newer version. The original Jelling Church was built by Harald Bluetooth, who was really the first real king of Denmark, although his father Gorm the Old called himself king. And so it is the kings, by and large, who are building the first churches. And this is a very small church. It's very tiny and very plain, isn't it? It's quite similar to the original one. Here is the interior of that church. And it's very small and plain, and it has quite a different setup than most churches do. Notice that there's a kind of arch, and the altar is behind this arch. It's almost far away, removed from the congregation, in the same way that Byzantine churches are designed. And so this is an interesting feature of that church. And if you'll notice, inside of this Holy of Holies, where the altar is, this would be the apse, there are murals all over the wall, and here are some of those murals. I think they're very much restored. They're not at all in their original state, but they're recalling what there was originally on those walls. This is concurrent with what was going on in the continent, that the churches were small, they were plain, and they had murals on the walls at the time of Harald Bluetooth. So this would be fully using continental traditions, although this church would be a lot smaller than similar churches on the continent, although some churches were quite large. And here is the Scandinavian world, and of course what we're dealing with is Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the three countries that we're going to look at. The missionaries are coming from this area of Germany, and they're also coming from England. Okay, and here is the Viking world, where the Vikings would have come in contact with Christians all over the place, everywhere they went, except for Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, which of course the Icelanders voted to convert, which is very strange, but they had German and English missionaries in Iceland as well. And here we can see the Western Empire in 843. That's a little bit later than Louis the Pious. This is at the time of his sons, actually, who divided up the Carolingian Empire into 3 areas. This is Charles the Bald, this is Lothar, and this is Louis the German. So these are the sons of Louis the Pious who then divided up the Carolingian Empire. Just to give you a context for what time period we're talking about here. Well, Pope Paschal I had appointed Ibo, Archbishop of Reims, legate to the Swedes, the Danes, and the Slavs, and other northern states. And so Ibo was really the first missionary who set out for that area. And that's interesting that he was an Archbishop of Reims. That's a very high-ranking missionary to go to the Swedes, the Danes, and the Slavs. Then, in 826, King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark came to Louis's court in Germany. This is again Louis the Pious, to seek help against his enemies. And with Harald were his wife, his brother, and his retinue. And Louis, in fact, baptized Harald Bluetooth and his family himself. And King Louis stood as godfather to King Harald. At this point, there was a particular missionary who set out to go to be a missionary to the Danes, and this is Ansgar, a monk of Corby, who volunteered to go as a missionary to Denmark. And Corby was probably the chief monastery that had been built by Charlemagne, one of the largest ones in the Carolingian Empire, so it was an important monastery. Ansgar brought with him a fellow monk named Aubert, and they set up a school, possibly in Hedeby, and interestingly, they purchased students. Now, this is a particularly Viking way of evangelizing, to pay them to go to church, and you can see why it's particularly attractive to the Vikings, and it worked very well. So they were inventive to do that. But Aubert fell ill, and Ansgar then was recalled to Louis's court. So this was the first movement, and they did have a few followers. I used to have a picture of Louis the Pious. I couldn't find it, but this is a Frankish king, and I'm not sure of what era, but he's here in the middle of his military chiefs and his and his churchmen. So this represents a king of France. Ansgar, once he had returned to Louis's court, then he asked King Louis if he could go as a missionary to Sweden at the request of the Swedes. And remember that the Rus had asked for missionaries to come. And so he then went to Sweden, and he took with him a fellow monk, Whitmar. They went by land and sea, and on the way they were attacked by pirates and robbed of almost everything. When they got to Sweden, they reached Birka, and King Bjorn received them kindly. Then Bjorn, with the consent of his chief men, permitted Ansgar to preach and to baptize. Bjorn, the king, did not convert, but others did. And among the others who chiefly converted were Herigar, a trusted royal counselor, who then built a church on his own lands. And that was the pattern we saw in Iceland, wasn't it? The Christians largely built churches on their own lands. Well, in 831, Ansgar returned, this time to Germany, and instead of going to Louis the Pious's court, he went to the emperor's court to report on his successes. And I'm sorry I didn't check the dates. This might have been because Louis the Pious died, and the emperor at that point may well have been one of his sons, who would have been Louis the German at that point. And so here we see the Western Empire right at this time, and these would be the lands of Louis the German right here in 870, and the lands of, unless he went to see the Emperor Lothar, who was here, and Charles the Bald was in this area of France, the three sons of Louis the Pious. Here is the Emperor Lothar, so that we can see at least what these Frankish emperors would have looked like, the heirs of Charlemagne at that time. Louis at that time, this might have been Louis the German, I think, founded the see of Hamburg to oversee missions to Scandinavia. So he founded a new archiepiscopal see that was a missionary see in the north of Germany that was to act as a base from which all the missionaries would be launched to convert Scandinavia. And Ansgar, who had already been to Denmark and to Sweden, was now appointed the first Archbishop of Hamburg. He was consecrated by Drogo of Metz, who was assisted by the Archbishops of Reims, Mainz, and Trier. And so here we have 4 archbishops consecrating the new Archbishop of Hamburg. You can imagine what a solemn scene it was and how important it was to the church to make such a ceremony. In addition to the archbishops of Reims, Mainz, and Trier were the bishops of Bremen and Verdun, and all of these people are from northern France and Germany. After Ansgar was consecrated archbishop, he went to Rome, and he was given his pallium by Pope Gregory IV. And we remember that a pallium was a kind of stole that was the insignia of the archbishop that signified his power and his rule. Gregory IV then joined him with Ebo as missionary legate. So now Ebo and Ansgar were both missionary legates, and each of them were assigned different regions. Both served as archbishops of Hamburg, and Gregory consecrated Ebo's nephew Gotbert, who took the name Simon, as a missionary to Sweden. Gotbert was kindly received by Bjorn, so Gotbert was the second wave of missionaries, and he built a second church at Birka. So we see these missionaries filtering in. But Bjorn's joint king, Emund, possibly joined by Bondar, rose up against them and against Christianity. And at that point, Gotbert's nephew Nithard was murdered, and he then became Sweden's first martyr. At that point, Gotbert was driven from the country, and the see of Birka, which he had established by building a church, there was a see at Birka, but now it remained vacant for 7 years. There's some legend that some Christians remained there, but scholars think that they didn't, that everybody reverted to paganism again. So it's a very slow process. Ardgar was a hermit who was appointed by Ansgar, and he worked at Birka until Herigar died. Then, in 845, Danish pirates, who, that is, Vikings, of course, burnt Hamburg to the ground, including the monastery and the library, and Ansgar barely escaped. Now the bishoprics of Hamburg and Bremen were united in Bremen, and so actually the bishopric of Hamburg was removed to Bremen, which is farther south, and now the see took the name of Hamburg. This move was opposed by the Archbishop of Cologne, who felt that this was a power base that was too close to him for comfort. He would have preferred that he be in control of all of that area. And if we look, here is the see of Hamburg right here, which is conveniently located just below Denmark. Here is Denmark, the great land fosse across here, the earthworks, the Danevirke, which is a fortification between Jutland and Germany, and Hamburg is right below that, in the perfect place to send missionaries. Now Hamburg has been burnt to the ground, and so the see has been removed to Bremen here, and the Archbishop of Cologne is very upset. And I didn't mark Cologne on this map, and since it's a very blurry map, I'm not sure I can find it. You see where Cologne is? No. All right, I can't find it. Should be right over in this area somewhere. Okay, maybe we'll find it on another map. Well, at this point, Pope Nicholas I intervened and against the Archbishop of Cologne, and confirmed the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, and gave Ansgar and his successors authority over the Swedes and Danes and Slavs and other northern peoples. So this is the see of missionaries to the northerners, and it's confirmed and ratified by the Pope. Meanwhile, Ansgar paid a second visit to Sweden as a messenger of the ruler of Denmark and Germany. He was not received favorably by King Olaf to Bjorn. Olaf and his nobles cast lots to determine the will of the gods, and when they cast lots, it's like throwing the dice, the oracle gave a favorable answer. An old man testified that the Christian God had shown himself helpful to seafarers in distress, and noted that it would be useful to have another god as a helper in time of need in case the other gods deserted. So the first movement was to add the Christian god to the whole pantheon of Viking gods, just, as an insurance policy to make sure everything went well. So the king allowed the mission to continue after conferring with his subjects and with his great men, and he gave Ansgar a hall to use as a church. Ansgar placed a priest named Rembert in charge, and this was another nephew of Gotbert. Ansgar then returned to Germany, but sent at least 3 further missionaries, and these included a Danish priest named Ansfrid, who returned to Germany on Gotbert's death, Regenbert, who was then murdered by Danish pirates on his way to Sweden, and Rembert, a Dane who was consecrated by Ansgar, who worked in Birka until Ansgar's death in Bremen in 865. Ansgar was then titled the Apostle of the North, and he was canonized by Pope Nicholas I. And in fact, most of this information about the missionaries comes from the life of Ansgar, which was written because he was sanctified, and so then his life as a missionary was written and preserved. Now, after Ansgar died, there was a hiatus. The Carolingian Empire was breaking up. In fact, all the grandsons of Charlemagne, who were the sons of Louis the Pious, were busy fighting each other and hiring Viking mercenaries against each other. And the Carolingian Empire was very much localizing, and so because of all the civil wars going on, we know little or nothing of what was going on in Denmark and Sweden and Norway, and especially Sweden. Rembert, who had been a missionary previously and who was a Frank, was chosen to succeed Ansgar in 865 by Pope Nicholas I. And then, after Nicholas died, Pope Adrian II made him legate for the whole North and urged Rembert to convert the Swedes, the Danes, and the Norse. He seems to have visited Sweden, but again, we don't have very much information about him, except that in 888 he died at Bremen. Adalgar was confirmed as his successor by Pope Stephen V, but once again the Archbishop of Cologne challenged his jurisdiction. Nevertheless, the popes upheld the right of the missionary bishopric of Hamburg, Bremen, and Pope Sergius II confirmed Adalgar in the archbishopric in the Union of Hamburg, Bremen. And now everything's deteriorating. All we have is a list of names. They must have sent missionaries to the north, but we have no records of them. But we do have a list of the archbishops of Hamburg, Bremen. Holger was next. And here we have, again, the map of the Carolingian Empire breaking up, and these are the lands of Louis the German, Charles the Bald, and Lothar in 870, and here we go to 887, where we have now a kingdom of Burgundy is in here too, and all of these areas are really breaking up into their component parts. The Spanish March has now separated again from the Carolingian kingdom, and these, you'll notice that different duchies are emerging: Brittany, Western Francia, Burgundy, Aquitaine, Gascony, and really Lotharingia and the Teutonic kingdoms, which are in turn broken up into little kingdoms. So the Carolingian Empire is really breaking up into localized area. Here once again is a Carolingian king of the 9th or 10th century, which would be during this very era. This is a chair. This is actually a bishop, not a king. So we might think that maybe some of our bishops might have looked something like this. This is actually a bishop, not a king, because he's blessing, and this is a bishop's staff. And here is the kind of throne that either a king or a bishop would have been seated in this era. Regenwald was the next Archbishop of Hamburg-Bremen, and we know very little about him at all except his name. Umni was the next Archbishop of Hamburg-Bremen, appointed by Pope John X, and he was a monk of Corby. He worked in Jutland and the Danish islands, and even made his way to Sweden and Birka, where Christianity had died out by this time. Nevertheless, Umni preached successfully and died in Birka, and he was buried there in 936. At that moment, Scandinavia also was tending to break up into small areas, which was the way it was in the beginning. Remember that Scandinavia originally was small, localized areas, and the kings would sort of pull the kingdom together, and then it would break up again when the jarls would challenge them. And unification, just like Christianity, came very slowly, and so you have this slow progress in Scandinavia. And so a minor king at that time called Erik Seager ruled the area of Birka. He fought with his cousin Styrbjorn over the kingship, and then allied with Harald Bluetooth to conquer Erik. On landing, he burnt his fleet so his men could not retreat, and then Harald promptly sailed back to Denmark. Erik sacrificed to Odin, Styrbjorn to Thor, and Styrbjorn was slain. So this seemed like some kind of an omen, because Harald was the only one saved, and he was a Christian who sailed back home to Denmark. Erik now turned against Denmark. He invaded Denmark, which was now ruled by the son of Harald Bluetooth, Svein Forkbeard. Who was Svein Forkbeard? Anybody remember who Svein Forkbeard was? You see, the lines of the Danish kings are very short. There aren't that many kings. Remember, Svein Forkbeard was Canute's father, who conquered England. Okay, so Svein Forkbeard was now king of Denmark, and Erik conquered the country. He was impressed by Bishop Popo of Schleswig, who went through the ordeal of the hot iron. What he did was carried the hot iron in his bare hands, a burning hot iron, and had hot wax poured on him. And the test is, if his hands and arms healed from the burn without getting infected, then God was on his side. And so apparently they did. And Erik was very impressed. He was then baptized, but when he returned to Sweden, he relapsed. And then Svein Forkbeard had control of Denmark again. Adeldag, Archbishop of Hamburg, died in 988, and from Hildesheim he was the chancellor of Otto I. And so Otto I was the first of the Ottonian emperors who had replaced the Carolingian emperors. This is a new line of emperors in Germany, a very strong new line that is going to take over the emperorship. Matilda, who was Otto I's mother, helped to choose Adeldag as the archbishop. Adeldag was able and ambitious and confirmed the jurisdictional rights of Hamburg and the union with Bremen. And you see how nebulous this connection of Hamburg and Bremen was, because it had to be repeated over and over and over again. And it wasn't confirmed yet for several generations. Adeldag showed more interest in Denmark than Sweden. He consecrated Odinkar, a Dane, to be Bishop of Denmark, and this is the first time we hear of Denmark actually having a bishop. He also consecrated Leofdag, Bishop of Ripa. So he was building a church organization, even though everything wasn't converted yet at this point. Okay, here is the Holy Roman Empire at the time of the Ottonians around the year 1000, and this would have been the area that they controlled. And here is the Emperor Otto III, who is of this Ottonian line now, the new line of emperors that are going to, and they're very Byzantine. Otto III's mother was actually a Byzantine princess, so there's a lot of Byzantine influence that makes them more imperial. Lebantius was the next Archbishop of Hamburg-Bremen. Sweden was still mostly heathen at that time, and the archbishopric had achieved meager success in 150 years. They had continued to send out missionaries, but they really had not done very much in the whole 150 years we've already outlined. But the next 150 years witnessed a remarkable change, and this really happened when Anglo-Saxon missionaries entered the scene. England had a long tradition of missionary activities, and Bishop Wilfrid had converted Sussex and preached to the Frisians. This was after, if you remember, that St. Augustine had gone to England, converted the King of Kent, and started a school and a church in England at Canterbury. And from that school came all these missionaries who went to the continent. First, Bishop Wilfrid, who had been another Archbishop of Canterbury, converted Sussex, and he went to Frisia and preached to the Frisians. Willibrord and 11 companions took up this work, and Willibrord was appointed Archbishop of the Frisians and had a see at Utrecht. And this is roughly contemporary to the very first missionaries to Denmark that we talked about earlier. St. Boniface, meanwhile, was the apostle of Germany, and he was an Englishman as well. He was the apostle to Germany, and he became the Archbishop of Mainz. He was also a missionary who evangelized the Bavarians, the Thuringians, and the Hessians, and he went to Frisia to preach too, and he died because he was martyred by the Frisians. So all of these, England had this just strong missionary tradition, and here we have England in the Anglo-Saxon time. This would have been before King Alfred's England. This is the time of St. Augustine, and this strong missionary community from England, which later on also went to the Carolingian Empire and went to the court of Charlemagne with its learning. Here is Pope Gregory I, who sent the original missionaries to England. And here are some of the Anglo-Saxon churches that they built there. There was a huge building campaign in England when the missionaries went to England. These are just ruins of the Saxon churches because the Normans pulled them all down. But they did have a really large building campaign, and they built a huge school with manuscript copying and production. Manuscripts such as this, which is comes from one of the Anglo-Saxon schools. And this is another later one from the School of Winchester, and so we have, in fact, the English schools could even read Greek as well as Latin, and they just had huge libraries. There was wonderful learning. A lot of the books that were gathered at the court of Charlemagne were brought from Anglo-Saxon England, so that they had. That was part of their missionary tradition. Here are some of the other missionaries to Germany: Willibald, Winibald, and Walburga. Walburga was the sister of Willibald and Winibald, and they founded Heidenheim in Germany. And one of the interesting things was Walburga became the abbess after her two brothers died, and so it was an abbey of men and women. Burchard, Lohl, Lisba, and Tekla, two other women who went as missionaries to Germany. They were nuns at Bischofsheim and Kitzingen. Wille had converted the Saxons, and he had been the first bishop of Bremen. So these are contemporary to Ansgar, who was the first of the missionaries to Denmark. The Norwegian church itself owed its origins to such English monks who went in that tradition to Norway, and the first was Saint Siegfried, the greatest of all English missionaries to Sweden, who came by way of Norway. And isn't that an interesting name, Siegfried? Makes you think he was probably one of the Danes who settled in England, because that's a Viking name, isn't it? Harald Fairhair had unified Norway in the mid-10th century, and you remember that all the Icelanders were running away from Norway when they went to Iceland to settle, because Harald Fairhair was being a tyrant, they thought, by being king. And so Harald Fairhair was unifying Norway. Eric Bloodaxe succeeded Harald Fairhair, but he was deposed, and then we saw him in Scotland, conquering in Scotland and conquering in England as well. Hakon the Good, foster son of King Athelstan of England, was then elected king of Norway. And because Hakon the Good had been the foster son of King Athelstan and had grown up in England, he was already a Christian. And Hakon the Good had been baptized in England, and once he became king of Norway, he sent to England for a bishop and clergy and built churches all over Norway. He even set the claims of the Christian faith before the Frostathing. The trouble is, the Norwegians didn't want to be Christians. They were not happy to be Christians at all. Here's the Carolingian Empire when all of this missionizing was going on at that time, and when Norway started coming together. Here is King Robert, son of Hugh Capet, who was the replacement for the Carolingians in France eventually by the time we're talking about. King Robert Capet became Robert I of France, the first Capetian. But the Norse rejected Hakon the Good's pleas. They didn't want anything to do with Christianity, and they forced him to recant and eat the sacrificial horse flesh, which must have been quite a blow to him as a Christian to have to eat the pagan sacrifices. Hakon the Good was succeeded by Olaf Tryggvason, who was zealous to convert Norway to Christianity as well. He had been converted on one of his voyages to England, as we've seen, and he was baptized at Andover by Bishop Alfaith of Winchester in the presence of King Ethelred the Unready. Wherever he traveled, he was accompanied by missionaries. John Sigurd, known in Sweden as Sigfrid, who also deserves the title of apostle to the north, along with Ansgar. Apparently, Sigurd or Siegfried was responsible for the conversion of Iceland, Greenland, the Faroes, and the Orkneys. So these English missionaries were being very busy going to all of these places. But the conversion in Norway was also due to the forceful personality of Olaf Tryggvason. He converted by force as well as persuasion. So because the people of Norway had refused to convert under Hakon the Good, Olaf Tryggvason decided that he would just force them to convert. And here we have Norway, the conversion of Norway coming from England, and through Norway the kingdom of Sweden was converted, and Denmark was converted through Germany. Horrible tortures were inflicted on Ivan, Kimrif, and Raud the sorcerers, and I have a little, if I can find this real quick, I could have a little thing to read to you describing the torture of the, okay, here it would be. The king certainly preferred that they would be won by peaceful persuasion, but if that failed, he did not hesitate to use force, and force of a terrible kind. Sigurd would seem to have been present on both occasions. Okay. For we are told that he used many suitable arguments in the endeavor to persuade Ivan to accept Christianity, though without success. While when Olaf's visit to Raud, who lived on the island of Godo in Salten Fjord, seemed to be made impossible owing to the terrible weather prevailing at the entrance of the fjord, which was attributed to the magical powers of the sorcerer, Sigurd, quote, took all his mass robes and went forward to the bow of the king's ship. He ordered tapers, candles to be lighted, and incense to be brought out. Then he set the crucifix upon the stem of the vessel, read the gospel and many prayers, besprinkled the whole ship with holy water, and then ordered the ship tent to be stowed away and to row into the fjord. The king ordered all the other ships to follow him. Now, when all was ready on board the Crane to row, she went into the fjord without the rowers finding any wind, and the sea was curled about their keel track, like as in a calm, so quiet and still was the water. Yet on each side of them the waves were lashing up so high that they hid the sight of the mountains. Olaf was thus able to capture Raud while asleep, and being unable to win him over by promises or persuasion, is said to have tortured him to death by forcing an adder down his throat. Okay, so such was the Christian conversion of the heathens. The massacre of wizards then took place by fire in the hall of the Nidarns, and the drowning of the warlocks at the reef of Wailing in Trotskjor. Okay. Okay, I don't have that passage marked, but what they did was torture people. According to a Christian chronicler, the king, seeing that the people's hearts were hardened and that with their mother's milk they had imbibed idolatry and that words alone would be useless to move them, had to resort to blows, and that in doing so he was but imitating his master, and that would be Christ, who poured wine as well as oil into the wounds of the traveler and was following out the gospel precept, compel them to come in, that my house shall be full. And I'm not aware of where Christ said that. I haven't tried to look that up, but I don't remember any such passage in the Bible, in the New Testament. Maybe some of you can find it. Well, Olaf Tryggvason's sister Ingeborg had married Ragnvald Ulfsson, Jarl of Västergötland, on the condition that he accept Christianity and command his subjects to be baptized. Okay, so the sister Ingeborg was a Catholic, and this follows a fine old Christian and Frankish tradition that many of the barbarians are converted through being married to Christian wives, and this was a conscious policy, for example, of Pope Gregory I the Great, who deliberately married Christian women to pagan kings in order to convert them. And so the same policy was being used with the Vikings. Olaf then sent a number of missionaries to the Jarl's territory, and Olaf's preachings had made him many enemies in his injudicious zeal for Christianity. He wished to marry Sigrid Storrada, widow of Erik Seager of Sweden and mother of Olaf Skotkonung, but she refused to announce heathenism. And because she refused, he struck her with his glove, and the blow cost him his kingdom and his life. Sigrid now married Svein Forkbeard of Denmark and fostered enmity between Olaf Tryggvason and the others. Around 1000, Olaf attacked on return from an expedition taken at the instigation of his wife Thyra, and after the fight, against overwhelming odds, he was defeated. The Long Serpent, his ship, was captured and Olaf drowned. Svein Forkbeard and Olaf Skotkonung now divided Norway between them, and both of them swore to be Christians. Svein later relapsed and persecuted Christians, but Sigfrid now comes to settle in Ostrabo preaching. And 8 years later, he baptized King Olaf Skotkonung in the well of St. Birgitta at Hedeby. And what was significant about the well there? What do you recall from our lecture about the Viking religion? Why is the well significant? Because important land spirits lived in the wells. Okay, so the well of St. Birgitta. I showed you a picture of the well of St. John, and these holy places of the Vikings became Christian shrines. I mean, very easily converted. So Sweden, Olaf Skotkonung was now Sweden's first Christian king. And here we see again Sweden being Christianized through Norway. Okay. Queen Thyra nevertheless blamed herself for the death of Olaf Tryggvason, and she starved herself to death. Thus Sigfrid came to southern Sweden as a missionary, but his life was not written until the early 13th century, and it's largely fictional and legendary. So Sigfrid is also called the bishop in the list of bishops of Skara attached to the West Gothic law. Others say he was a deacon or just a priest of York. And his 3 nephews were said to be Cluniac monks, so they were in the establishment. At this point, we can really see that all the kingdoms of Scandinavia have been Christianized. It was really Harald Bluetooth who started the process in Denmark. It was Hakon the Good who started the process in Norway, and it was Olaf Skotkonung who really started the process in Sweden, and then in Norway we have Olaf Trigg trying to force people to be Christian and succeeding to force them. And so all of the conversion took place with the sponsorship of kings. It couldn't have happened without the sponsorship of kings. Why do you think the kings were so interested in forcing their people to convert to Christianity? Why do you think these kings were so vulnerable to conversion? Is there anything about Christianity that would make it attractive to them that you can think of? What?
And land. Money, a lot. Didn't they bribe a lot of the kings to convert to Christianity, like in Iceland?
Well, no, they didn't bribe the kings. They didn't bribe the kings. What would the kings have to gain from Christianity? What do you think?
The divine right?
Yes, they would. Okay, the Christian theory of kingship is that God chooses kings. What is the Viking theory of kingship? How are kings chosen? By the people. Kings are elected by the major barons. They're elected by their supporters. And they can be deposed. If God chooses the king, who is going to depose him? Only God. And so this makes the king much more powerful, and it gives him a much better right to rule and a more secure right to rule. And so it's largely a political thing that attracts these kings. I mean, they see the value of Christianity to the power of kingship, and that's why it's kings who are in the forefront of the conversion. Well, the Christian conversion vastly changed Scandinavia. It took a long time. It took many, many generations for the people of Scandinavia to be converted, and we've already seen that with the Normans, that they still were half converted at the time of William the Conqueror in 1066, and they were probably the most Christian of all the Vikings, but because it took just generations for it to filter down to the common people. But as they converted, they adopted a lot of Christian practices. Here is one of the first churches, an 11th century church of Denmark. And it's notice about it that it's very plain. It's built out of brick or stone. This is stone, actually, and it has really very small, tiny windows with Romanesque type arches, and it's a very small church. It's not built out of wood because Denmark is not forested, and so it's built out of whatever is available. It has a very large similarity to the surviving Anglo-Saxon churches, in fact. It's quite similar. Here is another larger church, but still quite a small one in Denmark, and this one is built of brick. Again, it's got those Romanesque windows, and not very many of them to open it up, and it's got a little bit of sort of Carolingian brickwork on it, and it's quite small. Brick, again, is quite commonly used for building churches in Denmark, and here is another view of that church from the other side, and you can see it's got kind of a tile roof, and really those windows look like just arrow slits where you shoot arrows out, which suggests that they had to defend this church. But look how tiny it is. Very tiny. And this is quite characteristic of the earliest churches, the 11th century, in Denmark. Here is the interior of that church. It's very small. The chandeliers and all the gold stuff would have been added later, but just look at the architecture, the brick columns, the very plain round arches, the plain walls, no sculpture, no paintings, and this would have been typical of the first churches, the very simple ones built in Denmark. And I found this picture of a Norman church of the 8th or 9th century in Normandy, which looks quite similar to these churches being built in Denmark, which is quite astonishing to me. This is a Carolingian church, and you can tell it's Carolingian because it's very plain, and because these elements have no function. They're purely decorative, but they have these characteristics that later will be picked up by the Normans when they build churches in England, and they will take these decorative elements and make them support elements. It's very curious what they do, but this is a very rare church that survives in Normandy from the Carolingian time, and the Danes are building quite similar churches in Denmark. Here is a church built in York, which was a major center of the Vikings in England. Notice how tiny it is, York Minster. It's very small. It's cross-shaped, and it has a central aisle. This is the central aisle. These are the side aisles, and this is the nave. Okay, and it's very small. So this is quite similar to the ones that are being built in Denmark. Here is a priory in England that is quite similar, and it's of about the same time period. Again, it's quite ruinous because the Normans tore down all the Anglo-Saxon churches, but you can get an idea of the size. This would be in the area of Yorkshire. And here is a church complex in the Isle of Man, which was also settled by the Danes and controlled by the Danes. And you can see this very small church with a wall around the monastery complex. This is a little town here, and this is on the Isle of Man, and so we can get an idea of the early Viking churches in these areas when they're early Christianized. In England, we have crosses in the churchyards that are very common, and they remind you of rune stones. We're seeing the merging together of the Viking customs with Christian customs, the Christianizing of rune stones. In fact, this is what's going on with these stone crosses. And here we see a rune stone, a literal rune stone, with the first scene of the crucifixion. We've seen this before. Where is this one? Do you all remember where this is? Yelling. This is the Yelling stone. Yeah, the cross, the rune stone at Yelling with the crucified Christ in the first depiction of a crucifixion in Scandinavian history. Here is another church. This is the cathedral at Aalborg in Denmark, and it is stone or stucco and very whitewashed. This is the whitest church. It is just brilliantly white in the sunlight, and that was a brilliant spring day when I was there. But it has those same characteristics, Romanesque, very small, narrow windows, very plain. It's got a kind of fancy tower on it. But here is the front of it, and you see nothing like this in continental Europe or England. It is utterly unique Scandinavian. It is their very own style. They take it over and they interpret Christianity in their own unique way. And here's the cathedral at Aalborg. Here is the interior of that cathedral. And let's see if that's the interior. And I don't know if that's the main aisle or the side aisle. I think that's the main aisle that I was taking the picture down there. And it's got vaulted ceilings, of course, but it's very plain and very white inside, except that it has wall paintings at various places. And here, remember we saw wall paintings in the church at Yelling, and I told you that they were quite restored. They were very much restored. Well, these are restored too, but I think they retain that quality of the ancient wall paintings. I do have one church that had, it looks like the original wall paintings on it, but they painted their walls. This is an archaic artistic quality. It's archaic. The Europeans stopped painting their walls in around 1200 because they were putting stained glass windows in all of their windows. The Danish churches did the old-fashioned thing. They didn't do the latest style of the French. They were sort of set in the time of their conversion. It was like they were converted in the Romanesque period and they stuck to that Romanesque style. It's like the new styles didn't come in their areas. And so this Romanesque wall painting is on all the churches in Scandinavia. It's quite amazing. Remember, here are our church doors. Remember our church doors that we talked about before with Sigrid slaying the dragon on the church door. And so I didn't recopy any of the pictures I had of the wood carvings of all the stories of Sigurd the dragon slayer on all the churches, but the churches were distinctively Scandinavianized, and so now we've seen the churches of Denmark. Here is a church in Norway, and the Norwegians were extremely creative, and they built churches as were built nowhere else in all of Europe. These churches are made out of wood, which was their traditional building material, and they're utterly unique. And to me, they look like an upside-down ship. And we'll see that in another picture in a moment, when you can see, you can almost see the ship's prow coming up from the side of it. But you can see these wooden churches built in layers that are almost like an upside-down ship. I'm sorry I don't have an interior picture, but when you get in it, you feel like you're in the inside of a ship that's turned upside down. It's quite Scandinavian in feel, and of course nobody in Europe was building wooden churches anymore, because they were building them all of stone. I mean, they started with Charlemagne. Here's a close-up of that church where you can see the sort of wooden shingles on the roof and the crosses on every corner. And so we see all those crosses. Almost, they remind me of the what do you want to call them, gargoyles or serpent heads on the prows of ships, don't they? But now they have crosses on them. But when you get up a little higher, you see some serpent head looking things on the prow of the church as well. And so you can see how uniquely Scandinavian they are. They do have crosses though. And so it took a long time, and they all adapted Christianity to their own national character in very important ways. And inside these churches, lo and behold, wall paintings, wall murals. These are very hard to see because they're on wood, and here is the wooden inside of the church. And I'm sorry you can't see the ceiling. It's like being inside an upside-down ship. And here are the wall paintings. This, of course, is the Last Supper on that church. Here is yet another church which shows this Scandinavian innovation. And this too, this is older. This is the church at Lund in Sweden. And it's beginning to have that kind of wedding cake quality of the European churches, but nowhere near as much as you see in France and England. This is wedding cake quality. And it's all Romanesque. There are no pointed arches here. There's one up there on the tower, which I think is later, but they really stay in the archaic Romanesque mode instead of going into the modern Gothic that's being used in the center of culture in France. Here is the interior. Now this is really a different feature. This kind of a formation is usually in the apse, this curved place, but in the church at Lund Cathedral, it's in the entrance when you go into it. It's almost as if it's on the wrong end of the church. It felt like the church was built backwards when I went into it. It felt wrong. And then here's the nave, and you look down the nave, and it has these Romanesque arches, the round arches again. And the nave has this kind of Byzantine feel with a wall painting of the Christ. And doesn't this look like the church we saw at Yelling, where the nave, where the altar is, was kind of closed off from the main part of the church? And again, this very plain walls, but the wall paintings in the apse. This apse right here looks exactly like one that I can't show you a picture of, but it's a little church in Normandy in the area of Coutances called Cerisy-la-Forêt, and it's much smaller than this one, but this looks exactly like that apse in there, except that the apse doesn't have a picture in it, but the shape and the windows are the same. Here is the side aisle of this church. So it has side aisles like the York Church, and you can barely see the groined arches, although they are using groined arches. The proto-groined arches were first used in England by the Normans, by the way. They were the first ones to use those groined vaults that later became the rule all over Europe. And here are these columns that are in the church at Lund, and they are Romanesque. They have all these carvings and these pictures that are very reminiscent of the Norman churches in Normandy at that time. Here is yet another church. This one is in Denmark, And again, it's brick, it's very plain, and it has Romanesque windows. Here is another one in, I didn't write, this is in Roskilde. This is the cathedral at Roskilde, and it's a very grand cathedral because this is the seat of the bishopric, and this is probably the grandest cathedral in Denmark. Even so, it is plain and simple. It almost looks Carolingian. It doesn't have very many windows, and they're not very big, and it's very plain at the entrance. Here is the interior, which gets a little bit grander, but look at the apse. Again, it's kind of like that one at Cerisy-la-Forêt. It's a particular Romanesque apse that I'm tending to see in Norman churches, and very simple lines to it. Here is the apse. You can see it close up here, and these are not radiating chapels like a French church would have. I mean, it's a unique form of their very own, and lo and behold, we've got wall paintings again, which are characteristic of these Scandinavian churches. And these wall paintings are of birds and foliage, which probably they're more modern or much restored. But here's the one I told you about that I think is the most ancient of all, and it looks like it has not been restored. It's in its original condition, so you can get an idea of what the original wall paintings would have looked like in these churches. And this is in the church, at the cathedral at Roskilde. Also in Roskilde, since it's the site of a bishopric, I think it's an archiepiscopal city, there are the tombs of kings and queens, and I believe this is a queen. And so the tombs of kings and queens are in here, and here are the pictures of the royal patrons on the walls. And here you can see the area of the tombs where the kings and queens are entombed with soldiers guarding. This is more Renaissance, but you can get a feeling for the grandness of this cathedral in Roskilde. Also, we see the change in the artwork of making Christian objects. Thor's hammer was easily convertible to a cross, and so we see crosses everywhere. And here are gold crosses that are then converted. Here is one of the first crucifixes, which again is archaic looking. This Christ is kind of wooden, isn't he? He's kind of stiff and kind of wooden. He's not showing the emotion and the clear agonies of death that you see in the other 12th century crucifixes. But this one is more formal and more wooden and not so overly emotional. Again, it's rather archaic. The metalwork is put to work on reliquaries that then contain the bones of saints and martyrs, which can perform miracles of Christian magic. And so here we see the this metalworked casket with pictures on it. Here is another one that looks very Viking with serpents, or this looks like the prow of a Viking ship, doesn't it? And so you can see, but it has saints on the side. It looks very Viking. This looks like Christ's blessing on the top. And here you can see the saints. This is the Virgin Mary and the apostles on top. The crucifixion down here. That's a close-up of that one. And here is another of those metal caskets. It looks like it had some serpent's head that had been removed on both sides of that one. The metalworking that is now turned to Christian purposes. Another benefit they got from Christianity was a written language, written script, and education, and schools everywhere from the conversion. Remember when we talked about Russia, the very first thing that Vladimir did was take all the children away from their mothers and put them in school, so that in one generation he Christianized all the Russians. And here the Christians in Scandinavia had the benefits of school. This is a school, and this of course is the Latin writing that they now gained, which is why the sagas were written down, because they had the written script. And here is the Latin script that they that they gained, that they were able to write with. Now in Latin, they began copying books and putting them in very ornate book covers. This is a book cover, and inside is a hand-illuminated manuscript. I'm sorry I don't have a manuscript to show you. What is interesting about this is it's very Carolingian. It's archaic. It's old-fashioned. And these Carolingian jewels set into it, again with a crucified cross, Christ, who doesn't look like he's suffering very much, whereas on the continent they would have shown him suffering a lot. They would have shown him with great emotion. But this is almost Carolingian. It's archaic. Likewise, this metal reliquary with this beautiful enamel and metal work, but this Christ in a mandorla here, Christ blessing is more of an early medieval image of Christ as the judge. Notice the angels and think about how they might have thought about the land spirits and the elves and the dwarves and all the spirits they had. Well, they could be equated nicely with angels, couldn't they? And so here is Christ in a mandorla. Here is again a crucifixion of Christ on one of these metal reliquaries, and angels again, and again showing him in a very archaic way. Here is another of those metal reliquaries with pictures of the saints on the side. Now here is quite a unique form. This is an ivory carving. This is a book cover that's done or an altar screen. I don't think it's a book cover. I think it's an altar screen that's done all in ivory, and one can imagine whale ivory that they probably used with it. But this is very beautiful work. The people who did the most work in ivory were the Byzantines. So it really shows Byzantine influence, and again, rather archaic. Here is another ivory carving with a more old-fashioned view of Christ in a mandorla, and more of a Byzantine image than you see in the crucifixes. So now we've seen quite a bit of the art of the conversion of Scandinavia, and we only have about 10 minutes to go. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the formation of Scandinavian kingship and get started on it before we take our break. Okay, I couldn't decide what number to make this. The formation of Scandinavian kingdoms and conversion go exactly together. The theories of kingship were the impetus to conversion, as somebody said here. And the theories of kingship were also the impetus to formation of kingdoms, because why did the kings want that power of the divine kingship? Because they wanted to control more territory. They wanted to be like the King of England or the King of France. There are similarities between Viking institutions and feudal institutions because of the common background of the Scandinavians and the Germanic peoples on the continent. We have the same kind of lord and vassal relationship, a lord and a retainer, and we have the same kind of reciprocal obligations between a lord and his supporter. We have the same kind of military society. There are a lot of similarities, so that it would be an easy step for the Vikings to then adopt what they saw as beneficial from the continental kingdoms. England made a number of contributions. The missionaries and the theories of Christian kingship were especially strong in England, and of course King Canute would have had a lot of first-hand information in England about the kingship. And so all of these were crucial factors in the consolidation of all three Scandinavian kingdoms. And that was the adoption of Christianity. Those kings who first created united kingdoms, Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, Olaf Tryggvason and Saint Olaf in Norway, and Olaf Skotkonung in Sweden, are all remembered as much for their missionary activities as for their their nation-building achievements. The advantages of Christianity were the new ideology of a divinely ordained kingship, which raised the king above his subjects. In the old Germanic and Scandinavian ritual, the king was equal to all of his high men, his high supporters, and the jarls who supported him. He was only elected as a war leader. But the ideology of the divinely ordained kingship raised the king above his subjects, and it was opposed to the democratic origins of the Vikings. Also, when the kings of Scandinavia converted, it made relations with the Christian kingdoms of Europe a lot easier, because then they were dealing with equals. They felt that they would then be the equals of those strong Frankish and Ottonian, especially, and English kings. The church, in fact, brought able and literate administrators to the kingdoms, and so having the church there and having the literacy also allowed the kings to organize the bureaucracy of their kingdoms, to write down their laws and their law codes for the first time, to issue decrees, to have written codes of laws and written orders and written land grants for the first time. So the churchmen brought the writing there that enabled them to have a kind of administration. And the churchmen set up the bureaucracies. The efficiently administered kingdom enabled the revenue to be collected more easily and more reliably. This also reduced the king's dependence on less efficient ways of raising money, like plundering and conquering his men and going out and conquering people and going Viking. Now the king could stay home and collect taxes, and it was a much more reliable way of getting an income. It offered a peaceful route to the acquisition of wealth and status through service to the crown, so that now the activity of going a Viking could be replaced by going to the king's court. And we sort of saw that in Ale Saga, that some of the men went to the king's court and became courtiers, and they rejected the life of Viking. And so this was a trend that followed the formation of the kingdoms. The kingdoms were progressively centralized, as you have strong kings who were able to gather administrators around them. You could now centralize the church, and the church helped increase the royal authority by really advocating it and also ratifying it. The church also used the state for more efficient conversion, and in fact the boundaries of the bishoprics and the archbishoprics helped to define the borders of the kingdom. The Archbishopric of Uppsala was founded in 1164, which defined Sweden. It included the bishoprics of Svealand and Gotland, plus Abo in Finland. And it replaced a diversity of local practices and beliefs with a uniform religion. And remember that Scandinavian religion was never uniform. There were different beliefs everywhere, and some people were devoted to Thor, and some people were devoted to Odin, and other people were devoted to Frey and Freya and other gods and goddesses, and so there was no uniformity of belief or practice anywhere in Scandinavia. And so Christianity then helped all of the kingdoms unify, because they did preach a unified belief in Christianity, and this helped the kingdoms to attain a common identity as Christians or Christendom. The aristocrats and the ambitious courtiers quickly converted, but the peasants and commoners remained pagan, especially in Sweden. And there was a lot of Scandinavian crusading in the lands of the pagan Slavs and the Wends and the Balts and the Finns in those areas. And so there was a lot of crusading from that end, from the Scandinavian end. And so we've seen some of the reasons why there was centralizing of these kingdoms, and our major kingdoms are, of course, Norway, which at this time, there's a mountain range right here, and so it divides Norway and Sweden. It went all the way up to Hålogaland, because as the Norwegians were colonizing Iceland and England, they were also spreading colonies to the north, and eventually this was all included in the Norwegian kingdom. Likewise, Sweden started down in this area. Here is Uppsala and Gotland, and eventually it spread up here. And at times it included Finland as well. And of course they had their missionaries in Kurland. They're sending missionaries in this area, Kurland and Finland, and in the Wends in here to convert them. Denmark, of course, is here, and it was the earliest to convert to Christianity. So at this point, we're ready to look at each of the dynasties of each of the Scandinavian kingdoms as they formed, and that's what we'll do when we get back from our break in about, say, 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay?